And joining us now on the line from Washington, D.C., Michael Scheuer. He's professor of security studies at Georgetown University and the author of a new book simply called Osama bin Laden. And Michael Scheuer, as I welcome you to the program tonight, I want to start by reading something you wrote very recently in the Washington Post just a few days ago, and it goes like this. The rush in the West to proclaim the advance of democracy in the Arab world has led to the propagation of an ill-conceived and dangerous corollary, that the revolts in the Middle East and North Africa also mark the irrelevance of Al-Qaeda and other Islamist militant groups. Al-Qaeda sees history fly by, declared the New York Times. Uprisings put Al-Qaeda on sidelines, asserted the Wall Street Journal. And Western politicians, academics, and even intelligence specialists appear to agree with that. With peaceful and pro-democratic change afoot in the Middle East, the world has moved beyond Al-Qaeda, leaving Osama bin Laden writhing in the dust. If only that were true. Okay, that's a pretty provocative last line. Let's start there. Why do you think that's not true?
Well, I think it's not true for several reasons, sir. I think first, the most obvious one is we have somehow moved in the media and in the political system in the West from probably an over-reliance on polls, which at least were semi-scientific, to a kind of mindless reliance on those people in the Muslim world who are pro-Western and can speak English, using the internet, using Twitter, using Facebook, as sort of a measure of opinion across the region. It seems to me that the people who we have interviewed in Tahrir Square in Cairo, for example, are probably a thin veneer of 80 million pious Muslims. But the more important reason, I think, and the reason I wrote the book, is because bin Laden has consistently outlined his goals, his measures of success, if you will, and that has been to drive the United States as far as possible out of the Middle East, to help to destroy the tyrannies that govern the Arab world, and ultimately to weaken and destroy Israel. What we've seen in Egypt, Tunisia, what's going on in Libya and Yemen, all of those advance all three of those goals. If for some reason you don't believe that, I think you need, not you, sir, specifically, but people need to come up with another reason why that's not the case, why this whole process hasn't advanced bin Laden's goals, if you will.
Now, before we started this interview, I promised I wasn't going to call you Mike, and you promised you weren't going to call me sir, and you've called me sir twice already, Michael, so let's cut that out right away. Let me follow up with this, though, because you've given us a lot to think about there, and we're going to start to unpack that right now. Do you see, because I know we haven't, and maybe for the reasons you just expressed, but do you see religious fundamentalists at the head of these revolts? Because most people I talk to do not.
No, certainly not, Steve. They're not in the lead. I think for one very good reason. If you take the demonstrations in Cairo, for example, if there were people in those demonstrations holding up placards that said, Islam is the way, or Ayman Zawahiri come home, Mubarak would have shot them down, almost certainly with the full support of the United States and its allies. So it's simple survival. Why play a card that you don't need to when things are going your way?
But you seem to think that Islamist groups, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if I'm reading you between the lines properly, you seem to think Islamist groups are going to be asserting themselves in the days and months ahead and take advantage of revolutions that they, in effect, have not really led. How do you see that happening?
Well, for one reason, and I agree with you, they certainly were not in the lead or the result or the stimulus behind these revolts, but clearly leadership not only comes before the event, but in exploiting events that you don't expect or you don't initiate. And for a couple of reasons, I believe they will be very effective. First, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, the people we talk to, the people we want to win, the Democrats, the pro-secularists, have no organization. They're just outspoken and they speak English, so the media picks them up. The Islamists, however, have been organized and operating in Al-Qaeda's case for 25 years, in the Muslim Brotherhood's case for almost 85 years, and have organizations that stretch across the breadth of Egyptian society or Tunisian society, And organization is always an advantage here. And when it comes time to form a government, they have to be included, and they will take advantage of that to ultimately worm their way to the top.
I appreciate that view, but I think you also need weapons if you're going to take over a country. And I know you wrote in the Washington Post that Islamic fundamentalists are, quote unquote, feasting on stockpiles of weapons held by the dying dictatorships. Do you have evidence that this is in fact the case?
Well, sure. You know, the media is full of the reporting, although it apparently has escaped a lot of observers. The number of military posts and police stations raided in Egypt, the fact that there were 17 to 40,000 Islamic prisoners released during the Egyptian event clearly indicates that manpower is going to be no problem. And where do you think that the opposition in Libya got their weapons? And you know, it's just plainly obvious, both in the reporting and just common sense will tell you that those weapons had to come from somewhere.
Okay, how impressed are you with the social media that have got so much credit for generating all of which has, or much of what has transpired so far?
I think it's been spectacularly successful in generating what went on and in misinforming the United States and the Canadian public about what the reality of the situation is on the ground. Interviewing either by Facebook or Twitter or in person those nice, clean-cut, professional, middle-class Egyptians who are pro-democracy and speak English make everything look rosy. And again, I doubt they represent a tenth of the population of Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, for that matter.
Are you worried that sounds a bit dismissive?
No, I don't think so. In a society, in a North African Muslim society where the overwhelming majority of people are illiterate, why in the world would Facebookers and Twitterers be understood to represent the opinion of the entire population? There's something wrong in the logic there. I'm not dismissive of the social networking. What I'm dismissive of is extrapolating from what we read to entire populations of countries.
Okay, even if people are underestimating the power and the influence of Al-Qaeda at this point, as you suggest that they are, how can you be certain that the outcome, however many months down the road it shows itself, how can you be sure that the strong pro-Islamist element that you fear will come to power when, you know, everybody's guessed wrong on almost everything so far?
You know, I don't fear them coming to power. I just accept the reality of problems we face in the world, and this is going to be one of them. I am unable, perhaps because of a Jesuit education, to ignore the power of faith. And it's hard for me to understand why people assume that Muslims, be they in Libya or in Egypt, will, in a time of chaos, of uncertainty, and potentially of violence, why would they reach for an ideology they always have considered alien and perhaps pagan, which is secular democracy, instead of for a faith that has regulated, ordered, and graced their lives for the last 1,400 years? There seems to me to be a lack of evidence on the side of the secularists in that particular argument. People will reach for what they're familiar with and what they love, just as the Poles reached for Catholicism, which helped them to resist and endure against the Soviet oppressors until liberation came. And the Poles are still a very Catholic country.
But if there's one thing that many experts on this file have told us not to make too directly a connection with, it's the comparisons with Eastern Europe. They say that's, you know, it's fine to take that to a certain point, but don't get carried away when you make that comparison. And you know, one of the things we've also heard is that this could go, you know, it doesn't have to go the way of Iran. It could also go the way of Turkey. They might be able to put in place, given the strength of the secular movement there right now, and the fact that Egypt once upon a time did have democracy, albeit for a short period of time, it could go the way of Turkey, and maybe the secularists will win out. Not possible?
I doubt it, sir, and Steve, and I really would like to know the basis of believing that there is a secular power in Egypt or in Tunisia or in Libya at the moment. Clearly, we've talked to people and we've read Facebook and we've heard from the Twitterites, but we really don't have any feeling for the bulk of the population in which way they're going to come down. I also think there is a racism and an arrogance in the West, be it in Canada or the United States, particularly in our political leaders in our media, that somehow Islam is not compatible with a greater degree of personal freedom or increased economic opportunity. And I would argue that any government led by the Islamists in one of the countries in North Africa would be far less brutal and far less a monstrous regime than anything run by Gaddafi or Mubarak.
But just so I'm clear, you're not suggesting that the West should have defended Mubarak and his right to stay in power, are you?
Not at all. I think we in the West, and especially in the United States, are paying the price for putting all of our chips on a number of tyranny. Our entire strategic position in the Middle East depended for 50 years on the maintenance of tyranny to secure access to oil and to protect the Israelis. That is now collapsing around us, and I think the most wise thing we can do is simply stand back and let the cards fall where they may, because it's very obvious that the only card we have left is military intervention, and that clearly has never worked. First, because it generates such enormous opposition, and second, because American presidents will not use the power that's at their disposal.
Well, let me read another excerpt from what you wrote in the Washington Post, this one just the other day. Regarding what is to be done about the Muslim world, we should bend every effort to fix our oil problem and then adopt a non-interventionist foreign policy towards the Muslim world. What we want is Muslims killing Muslims and Muslims killing Israelis, a pox on both their houses. Now, Michael, I got to ask you, did you really mean to say that?
Explicitly, directly, and exactly, sir. I meant exactly that. America's founders intended our country to be a model to the world, not the imposer of our values or Canadian values or European values in the rest of the world. If the rest of the world wants to adopt what we have here in North America or in Europe, God love them, let them do it. But to use the taxes and the manpower and the lives of our children, whether American, Canadian, or British, or any other nationality, to try to impose on another people values they don't want is, to me, very close to criminal. And basically, the animosity toward the West has come from our intervention in the Muslim world. The problem in the Muslim world is basically intra-civilizational, between Shias and Sunnis, between Muslims and the governments that oppress them, and between Muslims and Israelis. Let them sort it out. This is none of our business. If Israel or Palestine disappear tomorrow, it makes not a lick of difference to the way life is lived in North America.
Well, you're saying two different things in that quote. The first part, we should have a non-interventionist foreign policy as it relates to the Middle East, is presumably a defensible position. You can argue that one way or the other. But to say what we want is Muslims killing Muslims and Muslims killing Israelis, a pox on both their houses, I mean, that's a pretty tough thing to say, isn't it, Michael?
I don't think it is. We don't want them killing us. I guess that's the definition of national defense. We should not be having our own people killed in wars that are basically none of our business except for oil and our desire to protect the Israelis. It's about time we begin to take care of our own house. At least, Steve, all I can speak for is what I feel for the United States and what I think our country should stand for. And I don't think it should be involved in other people's wars where we don't understand what's going on and the outcome of which is basically irrelevant to us.
Well, I totally understand when you say we don't want Muslim fundamentalists or terrorists coming over here and killing us. I think everybody's on side with that. I think the problematic line is, what we want is Muslims killing Muslims and Muslims killing Israelis. Why would we want that? Why don't we just want peace in the world?
Well, if it turns out to be peace, I think that's terrific. But what we want in a world of war, which is what we have at the moment, is the best possible thing for Americans or Canadians or Europeans or Japanese who have no interest in the fights that are going on between Israelis and Muslims or Muslims and their governments or Shias and Sunnis. Why do we need to be involved in that? We have just virtually no influence in it, except if we want to become the perennial military intervener to keep them from killing each other.
Understood. Michael Scheuer, it's good of you to join us on the line from Washington, D.C. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir. Steve.